Let us begin. Today, the topic of our conversation will be conciliarity, or speaking broadly, the phenomenon of the councils of the church, their role in the church, and deficiencies of conciliarity. Conciliarity is a universal phenomenon. It occurs in any confession, in every Christian confession. At the same time, in each confession, it takes different forms. Speaking broadly again, in Protestantism, ecumenism constitutes a form of conciliarity. So we were talking last time when we are speaking about ecumenism, about the ecumenical movement, that for the Protestant churches, the World Council of Churches, initially at least, was something more than just a platform for discussions, just a platform for dialogues. For many Protestant churches, the WCC still constitutes a model of Christian unity somehow. And ecumenism, ecumenical movement, which is larger than the World Council of Churches, is a sort of conciliarity, an embodiment of conciliarity from the Protestant perspective. The so-called conciliarism is an important feature of the Catholic history of the Catholic Church. The relationship between the councils and the Catholic Church, or speaking more particularly, the Institute of Papacy, were complicated. We are going to explore a bit more this relationship. I should say that there were periods, particularly in the Middle Ages, when there was an antagonism between the office of popes and the councils. That antagonism was sometimes rather severe and led to schisms, essentially, within the Catholic Church. Nowadays, conciliarity and papacy has been somehow reconciled. They have been reconciled in the Catholic Church. And this reconciliation happened at the Vatican II. But what followed the Vatican II was again a sort of tension between conciliarity or conciliarism and the papal office. We will be talking about this a bit more later on. And probably the strongest role that conciliarity plays among the confessions is in the Eastern Christian churches, particularly in the Orthodox Church. We were discussing at the first meeting that conciliarism, is one of the fundamental identities of the Orthodox Church. So we identify ourselves as the Church of the Councils. And this is somehow an alternative to it grew up, this identity emerged as an alternative to the Catholic Church identifying itself with the office of papacy. So even in this identity thing, we see how the antagonism between the papal office, the monarchy of one person in the church, has tensions with the conciliar, or, you want democratic element in the church. For the Eastern churches, conciliarity is embedded in every level, every layer of its administration. Even though we identify themselves with conciliarity with the councils, the relationship of the Orthodox Church with the councils is as difficult as the relationship of papacy with the councils. But we have our own difficulties because we don't live often up to the councils. and an illustration of this difficulty is the recent Council, Unorthodox Council, which I've already mentioned, and we are going to talk about this a bit more today. So the fact that we were unable to have a council for a long time and still are unable to have one properly means that there is something wrong in the way how we translate our conciliar identity, in the way how we function as the church. Okay. Let us talk about the terms. Conciliarity comes from the Latin word, which means concilium, and this word was used for the first time in application to the church gatherings. If you could pass this to others. For the first time, the word concilium was used in application to the church gatherings by Tertullian in the 3rd century. The Greek word synodos, which is exactly what council is in Greek, was used for the first time by Alexandrian Bishop Dionysius in his letter to the Church of Rome. And so this Greek word, the Greek usage was 1 century before the Latin word council, concilium, was applied to the church gatherings. But the term council, either concilium, Latin concilium, or Greek synodos, they are not biblical. We don't find these words in the scripture, in the Bible. We don't find this term in the apostolic writings. This term comes from a political culture of the Roman world and the Greek world. They were also used widely in the classical literature. So we find these words in the dialogues of Plato, or for instance in the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, or in the histories and fiction of Aristophanes or Xenophon, but we don't find it in the Bible. So this is a secular, classical term which was adopted to the church quite late, as I said, in the East, in the 2nd century, and in the West, in the 3rd century. Therefore, to apply a word from the pagan, completely different culture to Christianity, to the most important, to the most crucial institute of the Christian church, required boldness, required really an attitude which is open, which is really missionary, outreaching. And probably this term was not received unanimously in the church. Probably there were tensions over the term. We don't know about those tensions, but we know that there were tensions regarding other important words which were imported from the classical culture into the Christian theology, like hypostasis, for instance, to define the three persons of the Trinity. That word is not biblical either. Well, Paul uses it once. But essentially it is a term from the Aristotelian categories. And it was adopted into the church theology. There were discussions, and there were a sort of culture wars that we experience even now, either to embark on something new or to stay with what we have now, or to keep the status quo. So the open attitude won, and we use the terminology, theological terminology that we still have, including such terms as hypostasis, which we apply to the persons of the Holy Trinity, which includes the council, which is also a word which required, as I said, boldness to adopt, and which applies also to the word church, because the Greek word ecclesia, which was also adopted in the Latin language, ecclesia. By the way, again by Tertullian, he also introduced the word church to the Latin language, ecclesia. It is coming from the Greek political culture. Ecclesia were the gatherings of Greek citizens, free Greek citizens, to decide upon the political and the public affairs of their polis, of their city. So they came together in a special place, which was called ecclesiasterion, the place where ecclesia met, and they discussed different issues like whom to kill or whom to expel or whom to grant pardon. So that was ecclesia in the Greek word. Essentially, ecclesia meant the same thing that the synods or council came to mean. Because synods or concilium means an assembly, any kind of assembly. This is exactly the meaning of the word ecclesia. Ecclesia is an assembly. Therefore, the council and the church, they are synonymous terms. If we regard their etymology, their provenance, how they were coined and how they were accepted into the church. Of course, in our present usage, they mean different things. A council is a gathering within the church, and the church is the body of the believers. At the same time, in the 20th century, theologians came to realize. Yeah, I will tell about this more. Yeah, theologians came to realize that the very nature of the church is conciliar. The church is not just hierarchy, just structures, just institutions, and the councils are not just an optional kind of addition to the church. They are the same thing. The church is the council, and the council is the church. This has been particularly the point of such theologians as Father Alexander Schmemann, who is, as I mentioned already him, an Orthodox theologian here in the United States, and Hans Küng, probably the most known and quite controversial Catholic theologian. He has written a wonderful book which is called The Structures of the Church, where he argues that the councils constitute the essence of the church. They are not just a funny addition, optional one to entertain people. No, they are the church. In other there were other classical background behind the concept of council. The form in which the councils were accomplished in the church are similar to the political structures of the classical world. Particularly, the councils were modeled after the institutions of the Senate and the court. The way how the bishops gathered for the ecumenical councils was very similar to the way how the Roman Senate met. And the procedures of the council were very much similar to the way how the judgment was accomplished in the classical world. So the procedure of judging was quite established particularly in the Roman setting, right? There was a judge, there was a council of co-judges, there were people who were judged, tried, they had a right to apologize, to explain themselves, there were accusators, there were advocates. That is exactly how the ecumenical councils functioned, because the ecumenical councils had to make judgments regarding different issues in the church. There were those who were accused, there were those who were accusing, and there was a body of judges. And the council actually made the judgments regarding doctrinal or disciplinary issues and so forth. That's why the procedures were very similar to the procedures of judgment in the classical world. Okay. Yes, another important point is that essentially the councils embodied democratic procedures of the ancient world. In the period of the Roman Republic and in the period of the Greek democracy, say in the times of Pericles, before the tyrants usurped power, or before the emperors also usurped power, grabbed the power from the Senate and from the people of Rome, the classical world was quite democratic. Not necessarily exactly in the sense that we know democracy now, but still there were procedures of elections, there were procedures of accountability, there were procedures of exchange between the people and the representatives of those people to ecclesia. Ecclesia was a parliament, essentially, in the ancient Greek world. And it decided on behalf of the free citizens of the polis, which was a minority, actually, because the majority were slaves and they were not represented, but at least the free people were represented through the ecclesia. And the institution of the council, of the church council, emerged and grew in the period when the democratic procedures in the Roman world were almost annulled. In the Roman world, in the period of the growth of Christianity, the democratic procedures of elections and accountability were replaced with the procedures of patronage and appointments. So that, for instance, the administrators on every level were appointed by the administrators on the upper level. And the key figure who appointed the top administrators was the emperor. It was not possible to be promoted to any position without a patronage. It was not important whether people liked you or disliked you. No, it was important that an influential patron liked you, and then you could be promoted to any place, any position. The church challenged these customs and laws, because this was instituted by law. And the council was such a challenge to the Roman political culture, because the council essentially brought with it the democratic procedure, which was not acceptable anymore in the Roman society when it adopted Christianity. Well, in this struggle and the principle of monarchy, monarchy eventually won, and the church adopted the procedures of the Roman political culture, say by appointing bishops or priests for communities. So the initial Christian custom to elect bishops was replaced with the custom to appoint bishops from the authority from above. Okay? And also the role of the councils diminished in the periods of the increasing monarchy, increasing centralization of the society. Okay? So there was antagonism. There was a tension between the political culture of the Roman world and the democratic procedures which were embedded in the Institute of Councils of the Church. Is this clear? Yeah? Do you have any questions so far? Okay, let us proceed. So, the council was not just a single event when bishops came together and met and decided over different ecclesial issues. Conciliarity became spread on every level of the church life. This role of the councils on every level of the church life has been reflected quite clearly in some theological statements like the one that I quote here, which one of the documents adopted by the World Council of Churches has adopted, and it states that conciliarity belongs to the nature of the church, and it is a dimension which the church needs both at the local and all other possible levels. So all the level of the church existence and administration requires conciliarity. And these levels are the level of community. So every community requires some sort of conciliarity, some sort of accountability. In the Orthodox Church, it is usual and it is a norm that there is a parish council which decides over the issues regarding the life of this community. I think the same should be in the Catholic Church, in most Catholic churches. And this parish council is a conciliar institution. It functions and it embeds this principle of conciliarity on the local level, on the level of the community. Then we go to the level of the diocese. It should be that the diocese should have a diocesan council, and in most cases there are diocesan councils which function as advisory bodies to the bishop, but not necessarily. Sometimes the diocesan bishops, as well as the diocesan council, as well as parish councils, they are more important even than the bishop or the priest. For instance, if you take, I think it is the case in, for instance, the Orthodox Church in America, where the council of the diocese plays a crucial role and can overrule the decisions of the bishop, for instance. I don't think it is the case in the Catholic Church, where still the councils, the diocesan councils, are advisory bodies to the bishop, and they cannot overrule decisions of the bishop. It's not always the case in the Orthodox Church either. Well, the Orthodox Church in America is the most democratic church, probably in the Orthodox fellowship. But if you take other churches, especially in the social context where democracy is not welcome, there you find that the conciliar bodies are rather weak, and they approximately like in the Catholic Church, they function like advisory bodies, not more than that. Okay? So then we go to the regional church. Regional church, I mean the church of the country, or a larger region, like Church of Russia, or in the Catholic Church it can be the Church of France, the Catholic Church in the United States, for instance. So on this level, the councils also function, and they're also important. And actually, for the Orthodox Church, this is the most important level where conciliarity is practiced, where conciliarity is present in the strongest way. And then we go to the Universal Church, the level where the ecumenical councils gather, where the primacies are exercised and argued upon. This is the level of the Pope, ecumenical councils, and so forth. There, conciliarity has certainly its manifestations and its issues as well. Okay? So we see that at every level, there are forms of conciliarity or democratic procedures. They function or misfunction, or they fail. Well, they fail to achieve their goals, but at least as rudiments, they are present at every level of the church life. Okay? Is it clear? Good. Let us go further. So, conciliarity was a constant at every stage of the church life, as it is present even as rudiments on every church level, so it was present at every stage of the life of the church, any church, Catholic Church or Eastern churches, whatever. However, the historical forms of conciliarity were different, and they varied from period to period. Because we like traditions, we like primarily tradition words, so we keep the word council for the things which were quite different in different periods of the church history. So what they called a council, for instance, in the first century, was quite different from what they came to call council in the 4th century, or in the 11th century, or in the 20th century. Still, the council in any period, in every period, expressed the concept, the principle of conciliarity, but the forms, how the councils were accomplished, and the ideas behind those councils, because people perceived what is council in different ways at every time. So that changed. Okay. Conciliarity is a kind of twin of the church, twin brother or sister of the church. We were discussing that the conciliarity is the church, and the church is the conciliarity, right? Therefore, from the very early years of existence of the church, there were forms of conciliarity, even though they were not called councils, and even though they were not known in the forms that we came to know them later on. The earliest form of conciliarity was probably the network of the communities. So the earliest structure of the church was a network of the communities which were established by different apostles. The earliest known network is the communities established by Paul. And they were connected with each other through the letters, through correspondence. They were connected through common memories, through the common veneration of the founder of the network. And there was not just one network. We know about one network established by Paul because of the epistles that circulated in this network. But there were other networks that didn't leave documents. The scriptures, the early Christian scriptures, they reflected those networks, and they themselves are a form of conciliarity. Because why people want to exchange letters? Because they feel some kind of sharing. They want to share something with other communities. And this is already a conciliarity. So the scripture, the most part of the scripture consists of the epistles. Even the Gospels, some scholars believe that they were essentially epistles. They were letters sent to a particular community. They were written with a particular community in mind and were circulated among the community within the networks. That's why different Gospels may reflect different networks. Okay? And they constitute an institution, a form of conciliarity. The scripture, therefore, is one of the earliest forms of conciliarity. Is this clear? Yeah. Would you object this kind of interpretation? No. Then, in the time where the networks were forming, in the time when the scripture was shaping as well, it was not accomplished yet. The scripture was accomplished quite late, by the end of the 1st century or even beginning of the 2nd century, when the last texts, which were later on included to the scripture, were written. And it's interesting, should be mentioned, that the scriptures that circulated in different networks sometimes had the name of the founder of the network. That's why some letters, which we know as the epistles of Paul, were not written by Paul, but they were written by within the communities, within the network that he has established, and they bear the name of Paul upon them, but Paul never wrote them. Okay. So, in the process of writing those scriptures, before all of them were written eventually, there was a gathering in Jerusalem, which was the first proper council of the church. It has been described in the Acts of Luke, in the Acts of the Apostles, and it describes it as an event where the apostles and some leading figures in the church came together to Jerusalem to discuss an issue which was important for the Christian community of that time. That was the issue whether to stay within the Jewish setting, whether to remain, for the Christians to remain primarily a Jewish sect, or to step out, or to go further to the Roman world, to the big Roman world. And as I mentioned already, that was a great issue, a huge controversy. Even the apostles argued against each other in this controversy. And I said that Paul represented the open kind of faction within the Christian community, and Peter and Jacob, they represented a more closed, more Jewish-centered faction within the Christian community. Obviously, we can guess. We don't really know all the circumstances of this argument, of this controversy. But obviously, it was fierce. It was hard. And it was dividing for the Christian community. That's why the Christians decided to come together and to discuss this issue. We have already mentioned that that issue we can identify as an early culture war, because it was a tension, it was a conflict between the open-minded Christians and closed-minded Christians. Again, we don't need to blame someone for being closed-minded. They had their own reasons to be so. And as open-minded had their own reasons. So they clashed with each other, and it was a culture war. So the council in Jerusalem was to tackle that culture war, and it did it successfully. Because the solutions that the council suggested became workable, successful, and actually they shaped the modern Christianity, because this council allowed non-Jews to enter, to feel at home in the Christian community, in the Jewish community of Christians, right? And we are what we are as a Christian church because of the council, essentially, because the council successfully resolved that conflict, which was a culture war. This gives us a clue to solving any culture war, actually. There was a question when we are discussing this issue, if the culture wars can be resolved somehow, right? Yes, they cannot disappear altogether, but they can be solved, And one of the instruments to solve them successfully is the council. In the same way as elections, for instance, solve big culture wars, like in this country, for instance, right? You elect and you accept the will of the majority. Even if you are unhappy with the policies of the president who is elected, right? But because he or she is elected by the majority, we accept it. And this is the end to the culture war. Well, it's not the end, but it's at least it's a kind of a solution which doesn't make you happy, but make you accepting the the new president. So elections work as an instrument of solving culture wars in the big political culture. Councils play the same role in the Christian church. They solve, essentially, give a solution to the controversies over the issue of openness or closeness. Right? Okay? Is this clear? No? Did you know that? Good. We are not aware of any other council in the first century, except this one in Jerusalem. But councils became more common in the era that followed, in the 2nd, 3rd, and particularly in the 4th century. The 4th century, some scholars call it a conciliomania century, because there were so many councils that rejected each other, condemned each other, that was really, people were mad with councils. They didn't have anything else to do but to go to councils. And the councils emerged because the new issues, were faced by the church. It means that the councils are all, in most cases, reactive. They react to an issue, and they come to solve an issue. Therefore, when new issues emerged, the new councils were gathered as well. The first issues that were forced somehow the church to have councils was the issue of Montanism and the issue of the date of the celebration of the Easter. Montanism was a charismatic movement named after Montanus, a priest, a prophet, a very charismatic figure, together with two prophetesses, ladies around him, who also were like prophets, and they proclaimed the importance of the Holy Spirit, and they had a new prophecy for the church. They essentially tried to preserve the charismata of the early church, which were vanishing in their time. And they endangered the unity and integrity of the church. And the church responded to their challenge by having councils. So the first councils were gathered to respond to this challenge. Another issue was the day of the celebration of Easter. There were two traditions. One was connected with the name of John, the Apostles, and this tradition became spread in Asia Minor. And there was another tradition which was particularly important for the Western Church, for the Roman Church. And the two traditions, they celebrated actually Easter in different times. So, which was fine, which was acceptable for the church, but at some stage, the Church of Rome decided that we should have one day of celebration of Easter, and they imposed their own calendar, which was originally Alexandrian calendar. And they convened councils to decide upon this issue, and they decided eventually that there should be one day of celebration of the Easter. Yeah.
So why is it that now today Orthodox and Catholics have different dates
Yeah, we still have different date of the Easter, but it's not the authors continue the Johannine, the Asia Minors tradition. No, after that tradition was unified in the second and third centuries by the Roman Church. It was accepted both in the East and in the West. But later on, in the Middle Ages, new differentiations emerged. So essentially, we claim that we celebrate more properly the tradition which was adopted and that had been adopted at the time. And the Church of Rome claims that it follows more truly the same kind of decision which was taken by the council. Sometimes this year we will celebrate the Easter on the same day, but previously last year we didn't, and the difference was approximately a month. So because these councils were convened to solve an urgent issue, they were not often prepared properly. They were just, we have an issue, we need to come together and we need to discuss it, to solve it. They can be called as the councils ad hoc, just to make a decision immediately, on the spot. Okay? Most councils before Constantine, before the 4th century, were the councils ad hoc of this nature. Okay? Including the councils regarding Montanism, regarding the day of celebration of Easter, all of them. Then, in the 4th century, the councils, the format of the councils changed. In the scholarship, they are called imperial councils because they were convened by the emperor. This tradition started in the 4th century. And the first council of the sword became known as the First Ecumenical Council, held in Nicaea, in a suburb of Constantinople. What are the features of these councils? First, they were ecumenical because bishops from all parts of the Roman world were called to come to the council. Well, the Roman Empire was huge. It took sometimes months to go from one place to another place. Therefore, from some remote places, bishops had to travel months, literally. And it was not an easy enterprise at all. It was tiring, and the bishops were old, and still, and it was possible to travel at the time in this way only with the sponsorship of the state. The councils became possible in the 4th century because of the reliance of roads. We sometimes underestimate the role of the infrastructures in the spiritual matters, but I think the example of councils illustrates how important is the infrastructure, because the big ecumenical councils became possible because of the network of the Roman roads. The most important thing of the Roman Empire. You know that in Byzantium, for instance, the prime minister of the government was the minister of transportation, because transportation was the most important thing, because it kept the empire together. So roads made possible the ecumenical councils, essentially. And it was also expensive to travel. So the bishops were sponsored by the state to come to the place of venue. They were lodged, they were fed rather well, they were provided wine, entertainment, and all kinds of facilities for themselves and for those who traveled and supported them during the trips. And that was not all that the imperial authorities did during the councils. the emperor personally sometimes presided over the council. So the emperor was present, or if he was unable to be present in person, he assigned someone of his high officials to be present at the council. So the councils were always attended by someone from the imperial court, if not by the emperor himself. Like Constantine personally attended the Nicene Council. They were cautious enough not to intervene very much in the procedures, but certainly they set some agendas for the council. So they expressed what they expected from the councils. And it's interesting that every council, every ecumenical council, was attended by someone and even presided over by someone from the imperial court, but none was attended by the Pope. It doesn't mean that the Roman bishop was not present somehow at the council. He usually sent his legates, his delegates, to the council, who communicated Pope's desires and decisions, his standpoints regarding the issues that were discussed at the council. Well, the imperial councils were an imperial enterprise. The emperor paid for the travel expenses and accommodation, lodging for the delegates of the councils. He presided sometimes, or he sent his representatives. He sometimes formed the agenda of the council, and the emperor also made the decisions of the council a law. It became particularly important after Justinian. Justinian, in the 5th century, introduced a new codex of law, the so-called Justinianian Codex Juris Civilis, where he introduced a norm that every single council of the church was valid only if it was put in the form of a state law. When the emperor promulgated the decision of the council as a law, of course, then the decisions of the councils were enforced by police, by soldiers. So people who didn't want to accept the decision of the council were acting against the law, and they were persecuted correspondingly. They were executed, they were exiled, they were deprived of their properties, and so forth. At the same time, this was an instrument of controlling the decisions of the councils, because the councils constituted a huge risk for the imperial power, because it was unpredictable. The council, as it is now, and there were complaints in the period of the ecumenical councils, all those unmanageable, sometimes crazy bishops came together, and they had each their own agenda, and they could not be speaking the same language. So there were real problems of miscommunication at the council. Bishops, sometimes crazy, came together and tried to promote their agendas. But at the same time, there was an existential risk to the imperial power from stemming from the councils as democratic institutions within the church. They tried to accommodate, they tried to make comfortable the council and to accommodate the council to their own agendas. But they realized it is always a risk, because the council could decide something which is not predefined by the imperial authority. And it was always like that. The most, well-fed, drunk bishops who were, provided with plenty of wine remained unpredictable and a risk for the imperial power. Okay? That's why at some times, in some periods, emperors did not convene councils. They did not like to have councils. Is this clear? So we, in the East, we have 7 ecumenical councils. There are more in the Western Church, especially in the period of the Middle Ages. But the Western ecumenical councils after this one, they were not really imperial because they were convened by the Church of Rome and not by the imperial authorities. This one, all the ecumenical councils of the Eastern Church were imperial. They were convened with the assistance of the imperial authorities. Starting with Nicaea I, which was gathered by Constantine, 325, and which tackled Arianism. We will be talking more about each council in the end of this term. But just briefly, I want to mention each of them. So Constantinople I, or the Second Ecumenical Council, was convened in 381 and was dealing with the same issue of Arianism. Ephesus in 431, not far from Constantinople. Now there's a good beer, Efes, the Turkish one, so called after this city. So they came together to consider the issue of Nestorianism, the way how Theotokos gave birth to Jesus and who was Jesus. Chalcedon did the same, considered whether Christ had 2 natures or 1 nature, and it was convened in 481. You see, this century, the 4th century, with the 2 ecumenical councils, was really the most conciliar century, the conciliar age. The same is this one, the 5th century, especially the middle of the 5th century, with 2 ecumenical councils really close to each other. There were other councils in between. Then the Council of Constantinople, 553, convened by Justinian, who wanted to impose a synthesis between Chalcedon and Cyril of Alexandria. Then Constantinople, there was a gap when the emperors didn't want to call any council. They didn't want council to intervene into their policies. And eventually the council was gathered in the end of the 7th century to tackle the issue of how many wills were in Christ, how many wills Christ had. And then Nicaea II in 787 was convened to tackle iconoclasm. And this one actually was convened by an empress, Irene. Well, this is a miniature depicting, it's an icon, a Russian icon depicting how council could be happening. Not necessarily that it was like that, because no one made any picture, any photo of the ecumenical council, but this is kind of reconstruction. Then, after the imperial authorities became weakened in the east, of course, the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed after the what was called the invasion of the barbarians, and which is called more politically correct in the modern scholarship as a migration of nations. And the Western Church was unable to have big councils, though it had still. But in the East, the imperial power became declining, particularly after the Arab Caliphate was spreading in the 7th century, and then 8th, 9th century, and eventually the empire turned into islands with different imperial authorities ruling over those islands and not really coordinating their efforts. So in that period, the ecumenical councils were not possible anymore, at least in the forms that they were convened in the first millennium. And the church returned to the councils of the format ad hoc, which it had before Constantine. It means that the church had some smaller gatherings which did not represent the entire ecumene, the entire world, the Roman world, and they were not well prepared, and they consisted of the people who could come quickly to the place or lived in Constantinople. At that time, because many provinces, especially in the east, were lost to the Arabs or to the Turks, to different invaders, and before that to the Persians, bishops refused to stay in their sees, in their cities. They came to Constantinople and just lived there. They were pretty comfortable there. Still, for instance, bishops of the Russian Church from the remotest parts of the Russian Church, they have their flats in Moscow. So that was the case exactly with the bishops at that time. So they came to Constantinople and they lived, many of them, most of their time, in the safe capital, again, well-fed and with plenty of wine and other entertaining drinks. And it means that they could come to a venue, to a council ad hoc immediately at any time. And they constituted actually the main force, human force for the new format of the councils, which were called Endymusa councils. Yeah, okay. Okay. Endymusa means the staying in the city, those who were staying in the city. They had an issue, for instance, the church had an issue, they wanted to take an immediate decision on the issue, and they knew that bishop, that patriarch, sometimes the patriarch stayed in Constantinople instead of staying in Alexandria or in Jerusalem, which were lost to the Muslims, for instance. And they just called them, come here and let us have a decision, and it was sporadic, it was not really a systematic. They did not represent the entire church, but they represented somehow, at least, some parts of the church. And they constituted councils, which became the main format of the councils in the late Byzantine and in the Ottoman period. And again, the role of the roads. Because the roads were not accessible anymore, the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure was destroyed or damaged significantly because of the invasions. People couldn't travel, it means they couldn't come for a big venue. So those who stayed in one place in Constantinople could come to the council. Again, you see, destruction of roads led to the destruction, essentially, of the Institute of Ecumenical Council. And it's interesting that about the role of the roads, that if we take the etymology of the word council, the Greek one, synodos, its root is odos, which means a way, a route. It means that people who go to the council, they are synody. They go together the same road, the same way. And synodos, essentially, can be interpreted as a venue where people came following the same path. It's interesting, there is another interpretation of the word council. Isidore of Seville from Spain interpreted the Latin word concilium as deriving from the word cilium, which was eyelid. And he explained that because bishops came together to the council and they looked at the same matters or in the same way, that venue was called a council because they were looking, they were believing at the same things. Okay, So for the Greeks, council was the place where people came together following the same road. And in the Latin language, it meant, at least according to the interpretation of Isidore, a venue where people came together to look at common issues, or in the same way, in the same direction. Okay. So it's about the role of the roads. It is even encoded in the word council. As I mentioned, there were periods of rather intense conciliarity of many councils, and there were periods of what can be called conciliar fatigue, when people were tired of the councils, or the emperors were tired of the councils, or the emperors didn't want councils to happen, because the councils would challenge their agendas, political agendas. I would identify several such periods of conciliar fatigue, like the 6th, 7th centuries, then 10th, 11th, 17th, 18th, and it's interesting that the periods of the ecumenical, of the conciliar fatigue coincided with the periods of excessive centralization in the church. So when the councils were put aside, the ecclesial power, the ecclesial authority became more centralized. Okay? And in this period of time, some substitutes of conciliarity, of the institute of councils, developed. Like, you can interpret papacy as a substitute for the councils. Substitute does not mean necessarily bad thing, right? It means a different thing. It means an alternative. And certainly, the authority of the popes was counterbalancing the authority of the council. Sometimes they were in the antiphase. They were in conflict. And when I speak about papacy, I don't mean necessarily Roman papacy, because the original papacy was Alexandrian one, the one that developed in Alexandria. And typologically, the Bishop of Alexandria was very similar to the Bishop of Rome. There was a time when they were in conflict between each other. They actually argued who had more authority. The Church of Alexandria was established by the apostles even before the Church of Rome was established by the apostles. And still, if you take the title of the Patriarch of Alexandria now, it is more pretentious, it is more ambitious, even the title of Bishop of Rome. For instance, the title of the Patriarch of Alexandria nowadays has, for instance, such features like the Judge of the Universe, or the 13th Apostle. It is still, there, and he believes he is. Though the present Patriarch of Alexandria is very nice. He doesn't very much care about the title. Or the Patriarch of Alexandria still wears a tiara, a papal tiara, the same that the Bishop of Rome does. Wears. The two papacies, Alexandrian and Roman, were very much similar in that era. And it's interesting that both felt sometimes challenged by the councils and tried to control the councils. Say, as I mentioned, the popes never went to the councils themselves. They sent their legates. And the bishops of Alexandria, they sometimes tried even more. They tried to control completely the councils instead of rejecting the councils, just to take a complete and full control over them, like it was the case at Ephesus, at the Third Ecumenical Council, where Cyril of Alexandria actually managed everything. Another institute that somehow substituted the institute of council is called pendarchy. Pendarchy consists of two Greek words, which means five, and principles, which means five principal church sees. That institute included Rome as well. So it was Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The primates of the church, of these churches, 5 churches, they were considered as a single body. So they sometimes decided among themselves how to solve an ecclesial issue. And that decision was received by the church as sufficient to solve an issue instead of gathering an ecumenical council. Well, imagine it's easier to have an exchange of letters between 5 guys than to convene to bring to Constantinople a horde of bishops from different parts of the universe, right? So it was really more convenient, this institute, but at the same time, at some periods, it tried to substitute the institution of the councils and to decide over the issues of the theological issues without taking into consideration the decisions of the opinion of the entire church. This was, for instance, the case with the issue of how many wills Christ had, 1 or 2, the issue of monothelitism. At that time, all 5 bishops, all 5 members of this club of Pendarchy took a wrong decision, that Christ had only 1 will, including the Pope of Rome, Honorius, who actually suggested this decision. The Ecumenical Council condemned Honorius as a heretic. Well, in the typical Roman Catholic handbooks, these issues somehow are not discussed because it is really controversial, because it challenges the main idea of infallibility of the popes of Rome. But that is a historical reality. Honorius produced a heresy, and he was condemned for this heresy by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And he was a part of this Pendarchy club. He was one of the 5. And the rest of the patriarchs did the same. They also yielded actually to the idea of Emperor Heraclius, who proposed this concept of 1 will of Christ. And they just subscribed to this idea, to the idea of the emperor. And that is the instance when the Institute of Pendarchy failed to support the kind of doctrine, to articulate a doctrine which would be acceptable by the church. So Pendarchy is a convenient substitute for the councils, but it's not always well-functioning. Sometimes it malfunctioned, as in the case that I've mentioned. Okay? So another substitute is Synod Andibusa, or the Synod ad hoc, which I've mentioned. Yes, it was again more convenient to call bishops who stayed in the same quarter in Constantinople to come together to share a cup of coffee and to discuss these issues. But still, it could not do always its job well. And sometimes this substitute worked well, sometimes it didn't. In the present situation, in the modern time, we have other substitutes, but not like the governing synod in the Russian Church, when the Institute of Patriarchs, Patriarch was substituted by Tsar Peter I, the so-called Peter the Great, in the beginning of the 18th century by the ruling synod, which became actually a ministry of confessions. When the synod becomes a political institution and made the church a kind of political department of the church, of the state machinery. But I don't want to go very much into detail regarding this. We don't have much time. The 19th and the 20th century, particularly the 20th century, became the period of conciliar renaissance. It was not exactly a conciliar manic century like the 4th century, but it was the century that appreciated the council and that reflected on the council, reflected on the meaning theological meaning of the council and its role and place in the church. The idea of conciliarity developed exactly in the 19th century. Before that, the church had councils but did not reflect on the councils. The church did not develop any theology of the councils. Such a theology was developed only in the 19th century, and the starting point for this development became the German idealistic philosophy, articulated by people like Kant, Hegel, and others, Scheller. They provided a theological and a new philosophical background to develop the ideas of conciliarity. And those ideas were brought to the church by the theologian that I've already mentioned. His name was Johann Adam Möller, a Catholic theologian from Tübingen, who looked beyond the institutions of the church, beyond papacy, beyond bishops. He looked at the conciliar nature of the community of everyone in the church, that everyone is included in the church, which was not a usual idea at the time, because the church was identified with the clergy, with the bishops, and people, ordinary people, were considered like, second-hand sort of members of the church. And Müller suggested that it's not so, because everyone is a member of the church, because the church is conciliar in its nature. And it was initially the idea of Müller. And he also connected the togetherness of the church with the communion of the persons in the Trinity. So he connected the Trinitarian theology with ecclesiology, with the idea of togetherness of the church. After him, I already mentioned this as well, a Russian Orthodox theologian, Alexei Khomyakov, developed the concept of sobornost, which is an Orthodox edition of the same ideas of Möller. And quite surprisingly, as we have already discussed this, Khomyakov turned this concept of sobornost against the Catholic Church, even though it was borrowed from the Catholic theology. Okay? Sobornost means conciliarity, essentially. It's a Russian word for conciliarity. In the 19th century, there was a boom of the councils that comprised both clergy and laity, the so-called clergy-laity councils in the Orthodox setting, primarily in the Balkans, in the countries that emancipated from the Ottoman Empire, like Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania. They began convening councils that comprised bishops, priests, and lay people, ordinary people. And they decided on a wide array of issues, including theological issues, how to organize their church, and how to organize their politics. So they also addressed political issues. They promoted a strong emancipatory agenda. So they were holistic in some sense, and they were really bringing back equality to the church, materializing the ideas about equal participation of everyone in the church. At that time, there was a statement of the so-called Eastern Patriarchs that stated, it was in response, I think, to the letter of Pius IX, that stated, I think it was published in 1848, it stated that the bearer of the truth are not bishops, it's not a pope, but the people of God. So that statement coincided with the councils of the clergy and laity in the Balkans, which were quite an important institution. It was a new modification of councils, but again, the spirit of conciliarity fully embodied in those gatherings. The latest council of this type, and the largest one, occurred in 1917, 1918 in Moscow, the so-called Great Local Council of Moscow. Its venue was delayed significantly by Tsars. The Tsars were against this council to happen in the Russian Church. The Tsars were not against the Church. Moreover, interestingly enough, that Nicholas II, who after his abdication, the council happened, according to anecdotes, at least according to some written testimonies, wanted to become a patriarch himself. He was canonized as a saint by the Russian Church, and he was against the council. This council happened only after he abdicated the throne. And it took some important decisions. Somehow it summarized the earlier Balkan councils, the agendas of the earlier Balkan councils, which featured a strong emancipatory agenda. This council also had an emancipatory agenda. And it's interesting that it became inspirational for Vatican II somehow. And people who designed Vatican II, some of them had in mind this council. So the emancipatory agenda of this council consisted of the emancipation of the church from the state, which was a very unusual thing because under Peter the First in the 18th century, the church became essentially a part of the state, and the synod of the church became a ministry for confessions. Then it promoted an intensive dialogue with the society and secularity, with modernity, essentially. And it was interesting that at the same time, approximately, the Catholic Church fought against modernism. Remember, the authors against modernism introduced by Pius X. And at the same time, Moscow Council said it's okay to embrace modernity. We are ready to do this. It also adopted rather radical changes in the structures of the church. It restored the institute of patriarch. And the patriarch was elected at the time, Tikhon, who before that was a bishop of the Russian Church in the United States. Then he was called to Moscow and became a patriarch. And he's canonized as a saint in the church because he suffered under the Bolsheviks and actually they let him die. This council emphasized the central role of community in the life of the church. So the church is not hierarchy, the church is community, is communities. So it's a fellowship of communities which are managed by the hierarchy, but the church cannot be identified with the hierarchy. That was the point of this council. Therefore, it recognized the central role of laity in the church. And also it emphasized the diaconical role of the ministry. It means that the ministry is to serve, the hierarchy is to serve, but not to be served by the church. Okay? This clear? That is a picture. This is actually Patriarch Tikhon. So, even before that, the Catholic Church had its own council, ecumenical council, which is called Vatican I. And even though this council promoted a very strong monarchical agenda, it introduced actually the dogma of infallibility of Pope. In its form, it was quite democratic, unusually. So it is a paradox about Vatican I, that it became the first council after Trent, after the 16th century, and the period of Reformation, and it embraced a very strong anti-conciliar agenda at the same time. And Vatican II restored a strong conciliar agenda in the church. And the last instance of conciliarity is the Pan-Orthodox Council that I have mentioned several times. It happened in Crete in June this year. Not every church attended this council. Only 10 from 14 recognized Orthodox churches were there. Its official name is Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, and it has been in preparation since at least 1961, when it was decided to have such a council at the Pan-Orthodox meeting at Rhodos in Greece in 1961. It's interesting when the Patriarch of Constantinople was talking about this council, during the council, he said that don't draw any parallel between this council and Vatican II. We are different. And this was wrong because essentially the preparation for this council began in the period of preparation for Vatican II, excuse me. And the idea was the same. For the first time, the Orthodox decided to have a council, not to discuss a particular issue, but just for the council itself, to have a council. So the council was presented as an end in itself, not to solve any particular issue. Well, of course, there were some issues which were figured out later on, but they're still not so important, and so crucial for the life of the church, so that the church could not survive without solving those issues, as it was the purpose of just having a council per se. All the councils before the 20th century in the Orthodox Church were convened to solve the problem. This one was convened to solve the problem of conciliarity, to demonstrate that we can come together and have a council. And as I said, I think it was greatly inspired by Vatican II, and inspired the people who were behind this council, like Patriarch Athenagoras. I mentioned him, Patriarch of Constantinople at the time. When we are talking about the ecumenism, he was very much behind the preparation, behind the conceiving the idea of having a Pan-Orthodox council. He was, I think, greatly inspired by that. A few pictures from this council. So these are the primates of the church: the Church of Poland, Cyprus, Serbia. This is the Pope of Alexandria, the funny guy. Patriarch of Constantinople, Jerusalem, Romania, and this is of Athens. Excuse me. So there are other institutions, conciliar institutions in the Orthodox Church, which are more handy, like the institution of synaxis. Synaxis is just a meeting. It's a meeting somehow ad hoc, and it was introduced in 1992 by Patriarch of Constantinople Bartholomew. The synaxis only the primates of the churches participated in the synaxis. It means not all the bishops. The council is supposed to be attended by all bishops, right? Synaxis is an institute which is attended only by the primates of the church. Primates is the popes of the church. Okay? The patriarchs and so forth. So these synaxes became the most effective instrument of conciliarity in the modern church. It is. I had the chance to attend one of them, not of course as a representative of my church, but I was together with the primate. It was in 2008, the synaxes that actually put on full gear the preparation for the Pan-Orthodox Council. And that synaxis happened in Constantinople. And it should be mentioned that the modern type somehow of conciliarity is rather negative. There is a tendency to contain, to restrain conciliarity. And this tendency, I am afraid, is both in the Catholic and in the Orthodox churches. So synaxes are fine, but they are substitutes for the councils. They are not councils, and because they are so popular and they are so effective, while the pan-Orthodox council seems to be ineffective, at least not so effective as it is expected to be, then it means that there is a problem with conciliarity. Also, there is a tendency to transform the local councils, which consists of clergy and laity, just to the councils of hierarchy in the Orthodox setting. That's another reduction of conciliaries, which we observe now. And it's interesting, the same developments are in the Catholic Church. After Vatican II met, there was a decision to have a follow-up of the council in the institution of the synods of bishops. This institution was envisaged as a really important institution which would help the Pope to rule the Church, but not just an advisory body. The advisory body of this Institute of Synods was reduced to advisory body in the 80s through the efforts of Joseph Ratzinger and his congregation of doctrine. He made an effort to make sure that the Synod of Bishops would not function as a proper conciliar institution, but be like a conciliar decoration around the globe, which was greatly a reduction of the vision behind the Synod, which was at the Vatican II. So, unfortunately, there is a tendency to reducing conciliarity in both churches. But it always comes in tides. Hopefully, there will be a time of increasing conciliarity.